They laughed at him for touching a piano he couldn't afford, but seconds later the whole room was on its feet. They say some talents are born and some are made. For Jaylen Brooks, it was both. He wasn't raised in a big house with polished floors or fancy family portraits on the walls. Jaylen lived with his mom and little sister in a modest duplex in Stockton, California, where the heater rattled when it kicked on and the paint chipped off the front porch if you leaned against it wrong. But inside that house, something special was growing, even if most people couldn't see it yet. Jaylen's love for music didn't start with lessons or sheet music. It started with a cracked tablet, playing old R&B songs his mom loved. It started with his fingers tapping out rhythms on the kitchen table while his mom cooked spaghetti on the stove. And one day, it started with a beat-up keyboard his mom found at a garage sale for $20. A few keys stuck when you pressed them, and the speakers crackled when you played too loud. But to Jaylen, it was magic. He would sit for hours, mimicking songs he heard on the radio. No one taught him where middle C was or what a chord progression looked like. He learned by listening, feeling, making mistakes. Most nights, long after he was supposed to be asleep, you could hear faint melodies drifting from his room if you walked by their house. Sometimes happy, sometimes a little sad, but always honest. Jaylen didn't think much of it. He didn't call himself gifted or talented. It was just something that made the world make sense when everything else felt too noisy or too big. And even though his mom was proud, always bragging to neighbors about how her boy could play better than anybody on TV, Jaylen stayed humble. Music wasn't about showing off. It was about feeling something real. He had no idea that in just a few days, all of Stockton would know his name. And it would all start with one shiny grand piano at a school he didn't even belong to. But little did Jaylen know, stepping into that fancy school gym would change the way people saw him forever. The fundraiser was a big deal. Every year, Riverstone Academy, one of the richest private schools in Sacramento, opened its doors for a big charity event. Students from different schools were invited to show off their talents. Singers, dancers, science fair winners, all competing for scholarship opportunities. Jaylen wasn't technically supposed to perform. He wasn't even a student there. Mrs. Parker, his music teacher at Franklin Middle School, had pulled some strings to get a few of her students an invite. She said it would be good exposure, and Jaylen, always polite, agreed, even though the thought of playing in front of a bunch of rich strangers made his stomach twist. The gym was nothing like he was used to. The floor gleamed like it had just been polished an hour ago. Banners hung from the high ceilings. Tables were lined with catered food Jaylen couldn't even pronounce. And right in the center of the room, sitting like a king on a throne, was the biggest, shiniest grand piano Jaylen had ever seen. His sneakers squeaked as he walked across the floor, sticking out in his slightly wrinkled button-up shirt and hand-me-down slacks. Kids floated by him, dressed in clothes that looked brand new, laughing in little groups, whispering behind manicured hands. Jaylen tried not to notice. He tried not to care. "Hey!" a voice called out. Jaylen turned and found himself face-to-face with a boy who looked like he had just stepped out of a catalog. Colton Bishop, dark green polo, expensive watch, slick hair. He wasn't alone. 3 other kids flanked him, including a boy named Brandon Fielding, whose dad happened to be one of the school's biggest donors. "You lost or something?" Colton smirked. Jaylen shifted awkwardly. "No, just looking around." Colton's eyes narrowed, bouncing from Jaylen's scuffed shoes to the old backpack slung over his shoulder. Brandon leaned in and whispered something to Colton, making the group snicker. Jaylen felt his cheeks burn. He turned away and walked toward the piano, hoping they'd leave him alone. He didn't come here to fight. He came here for the music. The closer he got to the piano, the more everything else faded. It was so beautiful, it almost didn't seem real. Deep black, polished to a mirror shine, its keys like rows of perfect teeth. He stretched his fingers out, just hovering above the keys. He wasn't thinking. His heart was doing all the work. Gently, he pressed a note, then another's. The sound floated into the air, pure and clear. He didn't notice Colton and Brandon whispering behind him. He didn't notice a few adults glancing over. For a second, it was just him and the music. But the moment was about to shatter. And Jaylen had no idea what was coming next. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The voice cut through the soft melody like a knife. Jaylen's fingers froze above the keys. Slowly, he turned his head. Brandon was standing a few feet away now, arms crossed, wearing a smirk so wide it looked painful. "You can't just touch that," Brandon said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "That's a Steinway. Costs more than your whole house." Laughter bubbled up from the small crowd forming behind him. Jaylen stood up quickly, hands stiff at his sides. His mouth opened, then shut again. He didn't know what to say. "I mean, come on," Brandon added, turning to his friends for backup. "Bet he thought it was one of those fake pianos you see in Walmart or something." More laughter, louder this time. Even a few parents nearby smiled awkwardly, not stepping in. Jaylen's ears burned. He wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't trying to break anything. He just wanted to play. "Maybe, if you ask real nice, someone will buy you one for Christmas," Colton said, nudging Brandon, who snorted. Jaylen stared down at his shoes. Dirty laces, worn rubber soles. He wasn't wearing fancy loafers like them. He wasn't even supposed to be here. Not really. Behind him, someone muttered, "Where's his teacher?" Jaylen bit the inside of his cheek, the metallic taste of anger blooming in his mouth. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, judging, sneering, assuming. Not just about the piano, about him. He thought about walking away. He thought about grabbing his backpack, mumbling an apology, and slipping out the side door before anyone could laugh again. But something inside him, something deep and stubborn, wouldn't let him. Instead, Jaylen slowly turned around, faced the piano, and without saying a word, slid back onto the bench. His hands hovered over the keys. "Bro, you don't even know what you're doing," Brandon said, shaking his head in mock pity. "Don't embarrass yourself." Jaylen didn't look at him. He didn't look at anyone. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and he played. But nobody, not Brandon, not Colton, not the parents sipping their overpriced coffee, was ready for what happened next. At first, the room barely noticed. Jaylen's fingers danced lightly over the keys, coaxing out a simple melody, soft, almost unsure. People shifted, murmured, sipped their drinks. But then something changed. The music deepened. Notes layered over each other like colors blending on a canvas. A rich, swirling sound filled the air, pulling heads up, freezing mid-conversations. It wasn't a song from the radio. It wasn't something Jaylen had learned off YouTube. It was his. Built out of nights spent in a cramped bedroom, out of stolen moments at school when the music room was empty, out of every frustration, every little triumph, every time he felt invisible. All of it poured into his hands, through the keys, out into the wide, open room. People who had been laughing just minutes before found themselves staring, drawn in by something they couldn't explain. Brandon's smirk faltered. He nudged Colton, but Colton was too busy frowning at the piano, as if trying to figure out what he was hearing. Mrs. Parker stood frozen near the back, her hand over her mouth. The melody rose, rolled, then dipped low, like a bird soaring and diving through the air. Jaylen's hands moved faster now, sure and certain, his whole body leaning into the rhythm. He wasn't playing for the kids who mocked him. He wasn't playing for the teachers or the fancy parents. He was playing for the boy who used to bang on a broken keyboard because he didn't know how else to say what he was feeling. For the boy who found more comfort in a piano than he ever did in a crowded cafeteria. The final notes spilled out slow and sweet, like a river winding to a stop. Jaylen held the last chord, letting it stretch and fill every corner of the room. And when he finally lifted his hands, the silence was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. No one moved. No one spoke. It took a few seconds before the first clap came, hesitant, like someone wasn't sure if it was allowed. Then another, until the whole gym was on its feet, clapping, cheering, some even whistling. A roar of approval so loud, Jaylen felt it in his chest. He stood up slowly, blinking out at the sea of faces, some smiling, some stunned, some, like Brandon's, twisted in something that looked a lot like regret. Mrs. Parker pushed her way to the front, beaming like she'd just watched her own son win a marathon. "You were amazing, Jaylen," she called out. He gave her a shy smile, tucking his hands into his pockets to hide the fact that they were still trembling a little. From somewhere near the back, a woman in a navy blazer, one of the event organizers, was already whispering to a man in a suit, pointing in Jaylen's direction. But while some were busy scrambling to figure out who Jaylen was, Brandon Fielding was trying to figure out how he had gone from king of the room to invisible. all because of the boy he thought wasn't good enough to touch a piano. The applause didn't die down quickly. It rolled through the gym like thunder, echoing off the polished walls. Jaylen shifted awkwardly on his feet, unused to this kind of attention. Back home, the only standing ovations he got were from his little sister pretending to be an audience of 100. Now, real adults, some in expensive suits, others in glittery dresses, were clapping like they'd just seen something historic. Jaylen glanced over at Brandon. The boy's face was flushed, his arms stiff at his sides. Colton muttered something to him, but Brandon just stared at the piano, jaw tight, lips pressed into a thin line. "Young man," a woman's voice called out. Jaylen turned and saw a lady with silver hair and sharp glasses striding toward him. Mrs. Anita Greer, principal of Riverstone Academy. He recognized her from the flyers. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone brisk but not unkind. "Jaylen," he said, voice cracking a little. "Jaylen Brooks." "And where do you go to school, Jaylen Brooks?" "Franklin Middle School," he answered, feeling every eye in the place boring into him. Mrs. Greer smiled, a real smile, not the polite kind grown-ups give when they don't mean it. "Well, Jaylen Brooks from Franklin Middle School," she said, turning slightly to address the growing crowd. "You just gave one of the finest performances I have ever witnessed at this event." Another wave of applause. Jaylen ducked his head, cheeks burning. "You have real talent," she added, voice dropping a little like she didn't want the whole room hearing this next part. "I'll be speaking with your teacher. We need to make sure you're given opportunities, the kind you deserve." Jaylen nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His heart hammered against his ribs like it wanted to escape. From the side of the gym, Mrs. Parker gave him a thumbs up, so enthusiastic it almost knocked her purse off her shoulder. Meanwhile, Brandon shuffled backward, trying to melt into the crowd. Colton caught his arm, muttering under his breath, but Brandon shook him off and disappeared toward the refreshment tables. The energy in the room shifted. Kids who wouldn't have glanced twice at Jaylen 20 minutes ago now smiled at him, nodded at him like he was someone worth knowing. A short boy with glasses even ran up and said, "Dude, that was insane. Where'd you learn to play like that?" Jaylen shrugged, feeling a shy grin stretch across his face. "Just practice, I guess." More kids gathered around him, asking questions. What songs could he play? Could he teach them? Did he take lessons somewhere? "No lessons," Jaylen said simply. "I just play." One mom leaned down and whispered to her daughter loud enough for Jaylen to hear, "You see, talent has nothing to do with money." It was a small comment. Most people probably didn't even catch it. But to Jaylen, it meant everything. For the first time all day, he didn't feel like he didn't belong. He didn't feel like the poor kid crashing a rich kid's party. He felt like himself, and that was enough. A few minutes later, Mrs. Parker hustled over, her face flushed with excitement. "You, young man, are about to get some serious attention," she said, half laughing, half crying. "Colleges, private teachers, maybe even scholarships." "Jaylen, do you understand what you just did?" He shook his head, a little overwhelmed. "You showed them," she said, gripping his shoulders firmly. "You showed them all." He didn't have the words to respond. All he could do was look back at the black and white keys and think how funny it was. This morning, he was worried about whether he'd embarrass himself. And now, he was the boy everyone wanted to talk to. But even through the noise, the excitement, the rush of congratulations, Jaylen kept one thing clear in his mind. He didn't play for the applause. He didn't play to make people like him. He played because music was the one thing that had never asked him to be anything other than exactly who he was. But while Jaylen was quietly soaking in this life-changing moment, Brandon Fielding was facing a much different kind of lesson, one he wasn't prepared for, and one he wouldn't forget anytime soon. Near the back of the gym, Brandon Fielding gripped a paper plate so tightly it bent in half, crumbs falling to the floor. He didn't even know why he was still standing there. Maybe he thought if he just stayed quiet enough, still enough, he could pretend none of it had happened. Pretend he hadn't mocked a boy who turned out to be better, way better, than anyone here tonight. But pretending didn't change the way people were looking at him now. Some of the parents had seen everything, the way he and Colton laughed, the way they tried to humiliate Jaylen. A man in a gray suit, probably someone's dad, gave Brandon a tight, disapproving look as he passed by. Another mom whispered something to her friend, shooting Brandon a quick glance that made him wish he could crawl under the refreshment table and disappear. Even Colton wasn't laughing anymore. He kept checking his phone like he had somewhere better to be, avoiding Brandon's eyes. Mrs. Greer, the principal, walked past Brandon at one point, didn't even acknowledge him. It stung more than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, across the room, Jaylen stood surrounded by smiling faces, teachers clapping him on the back, strangers shaking his hand. He wasn't loud. He wasn't bragging. He didn't even seem to realize just how much he had flipped the whole room upside down. Brandon hated how bad it made him feel. Not just guilty, exposed. Because deep down, he knew Jaylen hadn't done anything wrong. He just existed. He loved something deeply. And Brandon had tried to take that away from him, tried to make him feel small because... what? Because he didn't look like everyone else here? Because his shoes weren't expensive? Because it was easy? The worst part was, Jaylen hadn't even fought back. He just played. And it had been the perfect answer. No yelling, no arguing, just pure, undeniable talent. Brandon looked down at his ruined plate, the cupcake he was holding now a crushed mess. Maybe it wasn't Jaylen who was out of place here. Maybe it was him. He shoved the plate into the trash and slipped out of the gym, head low. Nobody stopped him. Nobody noticed. Inside the gym, the music started again. A different student this time. But the buzz of conversation was still about the quiet boy from Franklin Middle School who had stolen the night. But while the world around Jaylen was starting to open doors, he was already thinking ahead to what came next, and the decision he made would be even more surprising than his music. Jaylen stood near the exit, backpack slung over one shoulder, waiting for Mrs. Parker to finish talking to another teacher. He could hear snippets of conversation floating through the gym. That boy's incredible. Natural talent like that. You can't teach it. Did you hear where he's from? Franklin Middle. I never would have guessed. Jaylen tried not to let it get to his head. He remembered something his mom always told him. Stay humble, baby. Let your work speak louder than your words. Tonight, it had. The event organizer had already given Mrs. Parker a business card for a summer music program. Full scholarship if Jaylen was interested, and Mrs. Greer wanted him to audition for Riverstone Academy's arts program. A door had opened, wide and inviting. But Jaylen wasn't thinking about that right now. He was thinking about how it had felt to play, really play, without worrying who was watching. About how music didn't care if your shoes were new or your last name was important. About how sometimes, when people expect the least from you, you can give them the most. Not to prove anything, but because that's who you are. Mrs. Parker finally came over, eyes shining. You ready, Jaylen? He nodded. They walked to the parking lot together, under the glow of streetlights buzzing faintly in the warm California night. Did you have fun? She asked, unlocking her car. Jaylen thought about it for a second. Yeah, he said, smiling. I did. As they pulled out of the lot, he caught one last glimpse of the gym through the rear window. The grand piano sitting alone now, a soft reflection of light bouncing off its black surface. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if Riverstone would accept him or if the scholarship program would call back. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop playing. Not for anyone. In a world quick to judge by appearances, Jaylen Brooks reminded everyone that true worth isn't worn, it's lived. Talent, heart, and hard work speak louder than any brand name or bank account ever could. If you believe every kid deserves a chance to show what they're made of, no matter where they come from, share Jaylen's story. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with just one person refusing to be silent.